have my friend and colleague here, Mel Berwin. Thanks for being here, Mel.
Thanks for inviting me.
Tell us about what you do.
I'm director of congregational learning at a synagogue called Neve Shalom, which is a large congregation. We work with about 200 kids in our programs.
In a rare display of participation, I'm trying to be the best Jew I can. I read an email and I saw that you were doing a presentation on DBT, dialectical behavioral therapy. You had really familiarized yourself with DBT in your journey with your children.
Yeah, I have 3 kids. The way that I kind of came to DBT was that my oldest son was in high school and he was really struggling with mental health, depression, and anxiety. I had a daughter who was in middle school who was even more severely impacted by mental health challenges. She'd been diagnosed with a chronic illness when she was just starting 6th grade and just didn't have the coping skills to figure out how to navigate that and all that came with it. She was in and out of the hospital. She was in a lot of pain. She just felt like she couldn't fit in with other kids very well. They didn't really understand her experience of what was going on for her. Things kind of got worse and worse for her. Eating disorder and self-harm and all the things that you just hate to see your kid go through. And we were in therapies and in treatments, and it kept getting worse. And to the point where she attempted suicide at the beginning of 8th grade and then spent a few months in a residential treatment program for severe depression and anxiety. When she came out of that, she was referred to Portland DBT, to the dialectical behavior therapy program, which I wasn't really familiar with at that time. I jumped in with her. One of the cool things about the DBT program, I don't know if it's everywhere, but at least here, is that there's a really strong family component. And they really want the parents to learn the language and go through learning some of these skills. It's one of the things I appreciate because there are definitely a lot of therapies that really don't include families in the treatment. And what I found was that once I was in that program with my daughter, and then my son actually ended up starting DBT too, is that it gave us a common language. It gave us a vocabulary for distress tolerance and emotional regulation and some of the communication skills that were really helpful to us as a whole family.
That idea of having a common language, learning about your children's therapy without interfering with it. I work with teenagers and young adults. I've been a therapist for a long time. Sometimes parents are not involved. And on the one hand, it keeps up the confidentiality and the privacy for the child. But on the other hand, parents don't always know how to support their kids' therapy. Tell me a little bit about how hard that must have been. You had your daughter being suicidal and being at that place. What was it like as a parent then? And tell us about the shift once you got educated by DBT.
It is really isolating. It's isolating to have kids that aren't kind of following the expected route that you imagined them taking, and kids who are really struggling. It's hard not to feel some level of shame around that as a parent. It's hard to know how to support them. I really struggled with, am I being too permissive, too strict, right? So at the beginning of our DBT program, my daughter and I were in the same kind of class, learning the vocabulary and learning some of the skills and practicing some of those together. But at the same time, on a different day, she would go to an all-teen program and I would go to an all-parent program.
And can you give me an example of how DBT helped you address a parenting situation differently?
Yeah, sure. So he has this kind of idea, right? That in any circumstances, we have 5 different possible ways to respond. When there's a problem going on, like I said, you can make it worse. That's one choice that we can make. We can do nothing. Mm-hmm. We can radically accept the situation, which doesn't mean condoning it. It doesn't mean we're happy about it. It just means that we've really wrapped our head around it and we recognize this is where we're at right now. All of those expectations need to leave the room right now because here's where we are. My kid is failing high school, whatever it might be. And
that's what's happening right now.
This is what we've got. This is what we're working with.
Not to interrupt. I think acceptance is so important and so powerful. And we tend to misinterpret that as condoning or giving up.
Exactly. Exactly.
My kid is failing high school right now. That before we dive into that emotionally, that is what's happening.
Right. I'll go back to those 5 choices and then continue this thought. The other 2 choices are to change our perspective on the problem so that it's less problematic, or to actually solve the problem in some way. Mm-hmm. And I would say that all of us have kind of our go-to of those 5 different choices. Some of us are really wired to kind of do nothing, a little bit of avoidance, and we'll just see if it works out. Some of us are wired more for making it worse. Some of us have our habits that we go to that actually don't help the situation.
You give some examples of that. What might make it worse?
I mean, it might make it worse if I'm drinking because I'm stressed about my kid, and then my resources are actually lower, or my kind of ability to problem solve is decreased, or my kid is then stressed out about my drinking, or my kid is drinking. And that becomes part of what I'm focusing on rather than the fact that they're struggling in school. So those are all kind of examples of making it worse. Self-harm is making it worse. It's taking a problem of emotional regulation and it's adding another problem to it. Now we've also got to deal with how we're handling you cutting yourself. My kind of go-to is problem solving. So you tell me, how you're feeling about school and that it sucks. And my son would say, he told me once that he literally stood outside of the door of his classroom and felt like he couldn't go in and he couldn't stay outside. It was kind of a damned if you do, damned if you don't situation for him. And my heart just went out to him. And what I wanted to do was problem solve. Well, how do you feel? What can we do? Is there somewhere else you could go? Can you text me when that happens? Like all of the things that I could come up with for problem solving. And what I recognized at some point was that I was what they call fighting reality, which is the opposite of acceptance. I was still programmed to think my kid has to graduate from high school, period. There isn't another option. And so then if I hear that he's struggling or he's failing or whatever, I'm bringing all of my stress to that conversation and I'm problem solving and figuring out, how do we get out of this? How do we get back to the road that I was imagining him being on? And at some point I realized I was fighting reality, which meant I was bringing all of my stress to the conversation, my anxiety to the conversation with him. And it wasn't actually helping. He was not feeling that was supportive. And so instead, that reality acceptance looked like me going, I really just have to accept that this is where he is. He may or may not graduate high school. Okay. And then I could come to him and all of a sudden my temperature was like a little bit lower. And then I could really validate, which is kind of the next step of where he is. Again, not condoning it, not saying, God, I'm thrilled that you're failing high school, but just being able to say, that sounds really hard. I don't know what I would do in that situation if I felt like I couldn't go into the classroom because I had so much anxiety about it. And I also knew that not going to the class was making it worse. That sounds terrible. Just kind of feeling it with him, recognizing what it must feel like, getting a little more information even from him, being a little curious about, what did you do under those circumstances? When have you been able to go into the classroom or what do you do when you're in that? Allowing him to kind of use his own wisdom in that situation and share that with me as well. And then we could actually do some problem solving together once I wasn't in it for a particular outcome, because that helped a lot for me just to kind of think about it in a sympathetic way. And once I took my stress out of the picture, we had much more productive conversations. Then we could do problem solving together. But unless I was really in that space of radically accepting this is where he's at, he's doing his best, and it's really hard for him right now, and he may or may not graduate, then I could actually get to the point of being able to problem solve. And I think that took me a long time to kind of figure out through DBT. Even though we might want to reframe or we might want to problem solve, we actually can't do that very effectively until we first radically accept the circumstances. Especially by the time our kids are in high school, we have, it's getting in touch with how little control we actually have over their behaviors. We can encourage, we can tell them our expectations and our hopes for them, but at the end of the day, unless he figured out for himself how to show up in high school and how to address the huge anxiety that he was feeling, it didn't matter what I wanted for him or expected of him. At the end of the day, it was whether he was doing this for himself, whether he was showing up, whether he was able to take tests, whether he was able to pass the classes and graduate. And it's a hard lesson, right? And I think some of us don't even recognize how much expectation we have for a particular process or particular outcomes with our kids until we've gone through something like this and kind of say, I don't get to control this one.
Yeah, and I think that's the biggest hurdle for a lot of us parents, that we regard ourselves as good parents because we're involved,
Mhm,
but when it gets out of our control,
mhm.
we can't necessarily problem solve for a vision or expectation that's more about us than our kids.
Right, right. And I think for most of us, I would say we don't necessarily relate to our kids when this stuff is happening. Maybe some parents do if they've gone through really similar experiences, but I don't think that's assumed. Maybe I was a good student and my kid is really struggling in school, and there's a part of me that's like, why can't you just do this? Why can't you just show
Right.
up? Right?
A different
Um,
person.
yeah, they're different. They're totally different people, and part of the project of parenting, I think, is really just kind of recognizing that, and then that validation piece of kind of just saying, here's where you are. This is what you experience. And I'm not the expert on that. I don't know how it feels to be you exactly. And I'm here with you and I will listen and support you. Whether you succeed or fail in this moment or in later moments, I'm still here.
So you were going to get to the other 4 or 5. What?
Yeah. So those 5 choices, it's the making it worse, doing
Mhm,
nothing,
mhm.
radically accepting, changing our frame of reference or changing our perspective, and problem solving. And so those are the 5 choices that all of us have in a situation where we've got a problem.
Okay, so just to be clear, is radical acceptance always the good one?
Yeah, I think what I've learned or what I take from this is that when I find myself fighting with one of my kids, when I feel like here's their anxiety and it's meeting mine, that usually I am fighting reality. Usually I haven't actually radically accepted the situation that my kid is in to the point where I can say, oh, this isn't about me.
Okay.
Let me just be in this space with you, and then together we can problem solve. But I've got another example of that. So when my daughter was 18, she graduated high school, which was a huge accomplishment for her at the time
Yeah.
because of how she'd been sick a lot during high school, had a lot of fatigue, and had just had a lot of mental health challenges all the way through high school. So it was not a foregone conclusion that she was going to graduate either, but she did. And then she kind of crashed. It was like all of the anticipation of graduation. And then she really did. She just really took a dive in terms of her mental health. And one of the things that she did was she said, I don't want to take any more medication. She had medication for 3 different big diagnoses. And honestly, each of those diagnoses are potentially life threatening for her. So when she
3
said,
separate
"Mhm,
significant diagnoses that had medications
yeah,
attached. So
yep, yep,"
he decided to go off all 3.
she went off all of them. And she was 18. She felt like it was her choice. And I kind of freaked out. What do you mean you're going off all of your medications? And why would you do that? And the consequences of that, and how is that going to impact me? Because now I'm going to be sitting around waiting to watch. And if you're in that kind of life threatening situation, then I've got to take you to the hospital. They're going to put you in a hold. Like all of my mind was spinning with the what ifs. And
Mhm.
I was really scared for what was going to happen. And then I realized this is me fighting reality. The reality is she doesn't want to take her meds right now. And again, I just feel myself relax a little bit once I say, okay, this is actually just the situation. I have to accept it.
Mhm.
And then I could come to her and say, I've been feeling this as kind of something about me and the choice that you're making as kind of rebelling against me. And that I said, I'm not sure that's actually true. Is it? And she said, no. And I said, okay, what it does feel like a rebellion though, maybe. But is it a rebellion against the doctors and the medical system that you've been in? And she said, yeah, that's closer. Right.
Mm.
And so then we could kind of have a more connected conversation where I said, what is it that you really need here?
Mhm.
And I think she just needed to let go. And in the end, she decided to check herself into a hospital where she could be safe because I was then able to communicate with her. I'm really worried about this and this happening if you're still not taking your meds. And I don't want to be in the position of having to look after you in that way, kind of watch you 24/7 until things really hit the fan. She and I agreed to let her do an experiment and not go back on certain things because it's her body. And I needed to kind of just get to that place where I recognize that piece. And I had my own limits. I had the boundaries that I had to draw for myself, but I could do it in so much more of an empathetic way once I stopped kind of that fighting reality.
You know what jumps out at me, and it's been true of so many conversations I've had on this podcast is if we listen to
Mm.
our kids, we can then partner with them.
Yeah.
And then, ironically, maybe have a little bit of control, or at least be able to support them. If
Yeah.
we don't begin with a front of judgment or lecturing in a way that's not helpful. When you said, it feels like you're rebelling against me, are you
Mhm.
rebelling against the doctors? And then for her to say, that's closer, having a real conversation about where she's at.
Yeah.
Another thing you mentioned a while back that I think is really important is the shame we feel when our kids, let's say in society's eyes, aren't doing so well. It's like I want to start some kind of, I don't know, if it be on Facebook or some kind of chat of a parent group where we share little successes of connection with our kid.
I love that.
Like that. Like something like, I was driving in the car today and my son gave me this much information about what's going on at school.
Yeah.
It
Yeah.
was really cool.
Right.
And he just suddenly said, we're playing pickleball in PE and I really like it. The conversations are usually, he won this. My son is reading at a 13th grade level, etc. You know?
When my daughter, when she got dropped off at the residential treatment center, and I called a friend when I was driving over there to meet her. My heart was breaking thinking about her not being at home. And I called a friend of mine and said, give me some language. Give me something that kind of helps me figure out what on earth am I saying to her when I'm leaving her at this place. And she said, look for the small wins. And I loved that. It was so helpful. This isn't going to be a straight process. This is not going to be even, it's not even 2 steps forward and 1 step back, right? There's just nothing predictable about this process for our kids when they are suffering and when they're struggling. Mental health is not a straight line kind of diagnosis, because you're surrounded by all the social media that says my kid is doing this and here's a picture of them doing that and here's our beautiful family all together on this holiday and here she wasn't at home, and all I wanted was for her to figure out that she actually wanted to live. I mean, that was just so hard. So yeah, that those small wins, but you have to be, like you're saying, a support group where people kind of are speaking that same language, because other people aren't going to get it necessarily. How big of a breakthrough it is that your kid talked to you a little bit on the way to school, or that they were able to come up with a little bit more of a less of an all or nothing statement and
Right.
something with a
That's
little
a
bit more
great one.
nuance.
We don't celebrate the small wins because, well, of course you graduated high school, you know?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. We've got to
Yeah.
just set the bar completely differently. Yeah, I think that's really true. I think part of what you're talking about in kind of creating this support group is how we take care of ourselves as parents when we're in this situation, because it's hard. We talk about that sense of isolation. It's really helpful to find other people that really do get it. I've called my parenting experience extreme parenting, parenting through these extreme challenges, physical health and mental health. I hold close my people who I know are in that
Yeah.
extreme parenting club. I personally, I don't know if you've experienced this, Dan, but I feel like some of the things that people say that are really trying to be helpful in a crisis zone. What are you doing for self-care, or what do you need? And I found those to be really frustrating.
Mhm. What are you doing for self-care? Like
Right.
if your child is suicidal or
Yeah.
struggling on that level, what are you doing for self-care?
Yeah, like
It's
no massage is going to help that. And I feel like
right.
that it's not that self-care isn't important, right? It's not that we don't need to take care of ourselves in that situation. It's more, I feel like that kind of whole, there's been an industry created around self-care,
Mhm.
it's kind of commercialized in a way. I just felt like, what do I need? I need my kid to live, right?
Yeah.
There's nothing, if I'm standing today, if I'm not drinking myself into a hole, if
Mhm.
I'm still showing up for my other kids and at work, or any of those things they felt like big wins for me in those moments of crisis. And, each of us kind of knows what we're not getting during those times. And it's not like we can do everything. Sometimes I think that question of what are you doing
Well,
for,
it's shaming.
it becomes another burden
You're
for
not
the
doing
person
enough.
going through. Yeah,
Yeah.
right.
And
Or here's another responsibility for you,
yeah,
as if taking care of 3 kids, one of whom is having a major medical or mental health crisis, isn't enough.
which ironically is what we do to our kids when we're not accepted. You got to do this, you got to do that. This is another thing I get to fail at.
Yeah.
I remember
Oh,
kind of feeling like that as
such a
a
good point.
stressed out kid.
Yeah.
is you giving me suggestions. It's just more things to disappoint you
Yeah.
or that I'm failing at. What's something helpful someone might say?
Can I bring you dinner tonight? Do your other kids needs rides?
That's a great point. Be helpful.
Yeah,
If you want to
have a
support
specific
someone.
ask.
Yeah.
Because what do you need? Like, I don't know. My head kind of exploded every time I got that question, right?
Mhm.
It just was too nebulous. I just did. I'd go to this place of I need my kid to live, unless you can help me with that, stop
Yeah.
asking that question. But if somebody came to
Right.
me and said, could you use dinner tonight? I'd be like, yeah. Or,
Yeah.
you know what? We've got so many dietary restrictions. Just give us a gift certificate to Trader Joe's and I'll go
Mhm.
pick up something.
Mhm.
A specific offer, I think, leads to a specific.
I think that's really, really helpful. Offer the basic help we all need.
Yeah, and that you're capable of, right? Not every
Right.
friend is going to be able to like drive your kid to school in the morning if you need that. But, when somebody makes that specific offer, they're available to do that. And I think it makes it easier to say yes or no to it.
How are your kids doing today?
They are all hanging in there. My oldest son is in college now. He took a few years off after high school because he really didn't feel like he could go back into an educational space, but he kind of made his own way and he worked for a few years and took some kind of non-academic classes in acting and voice acting and kind of more creative types of spaces. At some point he said, okay, I think I want to be an engineer like I always thought I did, and I'm going to go back to school for that. He has matured enough that he's got a sense of where he wants to get to and that this is worth it. And
Mhm.
he's building skills for managing that anxiety. And he's excited about he's doing really well. My daughter still deals with a lot of medical, physical, and mental health challenges. It's a little bit of a way of life for us. I mean, that's part of what I've radically accepted. I see those small wins where she's taking a little bit more responsibility for her own medical care and conversations with her doctors and advocating for herself in these spaces. And she is doing the best that she can with the life that she has and with what shows up for her each day, which I think is just super admirable. Nobody signs up to be in an extreme parenting club. Nobody wishes for these kinds of experiences, but I really do strongly believe that if this is what we're given, that we need to kind of figure out how to use it for the good. And so connecting with other parents and getting to talk about this, it means a lot to me that people are bringing this a little bit more into the light so that we can all be here for each other. I also just really appreciate what you are doing with this project and these conversations that we've had.
Thank you. And now that I think about it, we are providing a parent support group. If you're in the Portland area at Eastside, what is it?
Jewish Commons.
Eastside Jewish Commons, the first Monday of every month at 7 p.m. We start with a kind of a parent support group, and then we have a speaker. Okay, Mel, we'll see you soon.
All right. Thanks, Dan.
You're welcome. Thank you.